Hello students, this is the final video of the semester, and this video is all about your 4 final exam questions and how you are going to answer them, what I expect from you in answering these 4 questions on the final exam. As you remember from the midterm, some of these are a little unusual. They aren't the type of final exams that you would get in any other course, but research methods is not any other course. So what I give to you in this video is essentially everything but the answer. I just need you to take this information, formulate it in your mind in a way that it has practical use, and then put that practical use into the answer and incorporate that practical use into the answers that you give. So this is all about looking at data, or raw data, trying to get raw data, and then interpreting that data. So everything about this final exam is about either getting data, describing your research, describing your population of interest, and or interpreting the results. It starts with 2 histograms. Histogram number 1, I believe you've seen before. You'll remember from assignment number 5. So really all this is doing is this is asking you to remember what you looked at in assignment number 5. But what we didn't deal with in assignment number 5 is on this second histogram. This is a histogram of the raw data based on income for everybody on the gss.sav data file, the General Social Survey. It represents income in real dollars. Histogram number 1, on the other hand, represents income in 24 quantiles. And for question number 1, all you have to do is tell me what the difference is in how this data is represented. Remember, this is the same study population. This is the survey population from gss.sav. And if you look up here in the top right hand corner, it tells you there are 993 respondents on histogram number 1, and there are 921 respondents on histogram number 2. So this is pretty much the same population. Some individuals didn't answer the right way. They either had to throw it out or else they left it blank. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same population. And you have to tell me what these histograms have in common and why a researcher would choose to represent income in 24 quantiles and or leave the income in real dollars. So that's what these questions are all about. And that's pretty much all I'm going to tell you to help you with question number 1. It's a very basic question. You should be able to answer that without much more help from me. So let's look at question number 2 now. There is a movement underway by several mental health practitioners to have religious trauma syndrome included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The person leading this charge is a practitioner named Dr. Marlene Winnell. To answer this question, I want you to take the position that you work for the American Psychiatric Association, and they've asked you to help them make a determination as to whether religious trauma syndrome should be included now. So you're going to have to come back to the American Psychiatric Association, your employer, and give them an opinion, one way or another. And that's what this question is all about. As always, in the preamble to the question that I give you in the file that you downloaded and printed out and you should have in front of you, I've given you some help, but I've given you some pointers where you can go to find out a little bit more about this if you want to. But as a starting point, what I've given you is this report from Valerie Tarico, an alternate journalist, who quotes a person who is opposed to Winnell's efforts as saying, "A religion, faith, or book cannot be abusive, but the people interpreting these things can make anything abusive." So this is one side of the argument that you could take. Or you could take Dr. Winnell's side of the argument and say that this is a religious trauma syndrome, should be included in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual. So to make it very clear, on Dr. Winnell's side of this argument, you have structured religion causing the problem. On the side of the argument that would argue to not have religious trauma syndrome incorporated into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual are those who say that these individuals are simply the victims of abuse, and yes, they may need counseling to overcome abuse, but it's no different than domestic abuse, it's no different than spouse abuse, and it's certainly not a disorder caused by the structure of religion. So I've given you a sample here of the traditional independent variable, dependent variable, intervening variable model here. And religious trauma syndrome is argued to be the dependent variable. So what I need you to think of in terms of every researcher is, if religious trauma syndrome exists, that would be a hypothesis, and the null hypothesis would be that it doesn't. What would cause it? What would be your dependent variable? What would be your intervening variables? A little bit more about Dr. Winnell's argument. She has identified symptoms of religious trauma syndrome. There are cognitive symptoms, there are emotional symptoms, there are social symptoms, and there are cultural symptoms. And you can read this, pause the video if you want to digest those, make notes about them. But those are the arguments that Dr. Winnell makes to have this included as religious trauma syndrome in the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Causes of religious trauma syndrome, Dr. Winnell has identified, is authoritarianism coupled with toxic theology, which is received and reinforced at church, school, and home. Results in suppression of normal child development. This is why she's arguing that it's a syndrome. This is not an abusive parent. These are structural dynamics of an individual's life. They are brought up in this toxic environment, and these structural dynamics have arrested normal development in these individuals. So there is a suppression of normal child development. There is damage to normal thinking and feeling abilities. Information is limited and controlled in this environment. External locus of control comes out of this religious trauma syndrome, where knowledge is revealed and not discovered, so there's no science in these cultures. Physical and sexual abuse typically come from a patriarchal power. So there's an unhealthy sexual view in her mind, punishment used as for discipline. So these are the arguments. You can once again pause the video if you want to look at this. But what you're asked to do, it asks you in Part A to clearly state an alternative and a null hypothesis. Once again, I've given you that dependent variable, independent variable, intervening variable model. So think in terms of that model and state an alternative hypothesis, and then you have to state your null hypothesis. This will be a mixed methods research project where both quantitative and qualitative research will be conducted. It is strongly suggested that you do not write your hypothesis until you have finished reading the entire question all the way through parts B, C, D, E, and F, and formulated some answers in your head. Also, I want you to read pages 18 to 19 of the Adams and Lawrence textbook to ensure that your hypothesis is a testable hypothesis. Once again, we're just moving through this. I want you to come back to part number A and write your hypothesis after you've kind of formulated your answers. So part B, to begin your research into the validity of Winnell's published findings, you determined that you need to do a nationwide survey, but because you have limited resources, you have decided to use maximum variation sampling, which is a type of non-probability sampling. So this is on pages 127 to 134 of the Adams and Lawrence textbook, and I want you to write in no less than 100 words what's your rationale for this specific kind of sampling and how it will be used to initiate your research into religious trauma syndrome. So this is a quantitative portion of your research. I am telling you that you have decided to use maximum variation sampling. Why? Okay, it's a type of non-probability sampling. Make sure you incorporate that word into your answer as well. All of the answer, everything you need to know is on pages 127 to 134. Part number C is worth 2 points. I want you to identify which research design you have outlined in Part B. So in Part B, you described something to me, and I want you to tell me now, looking on page 19 of the Adams and Lawrence textbook, exactly which research design you have outlined. Okay, part number D, 3 points. Fast forward 6 months now, so you've got all of your results in, your survey results have come back, and your quantitative analysis has shown that out of the numerous fundamentalist Christian sects in the United States, which your non-probability sampling focused on, one set in particular seems to be manifesting as an exceptionally high rate of this phenomenon that Dr. Winnell references as religious trauma syndrome. Because this particular sect seems to be concentrated in several hundred small suburban communities of a particular region of the country, you decide that the survey findings warrant a deeper qualitative analysis. You have decided to visit one, and only one, of these communities to deepen your understanding of the phenomenon. To answer this portion of the question, you need to determine whether to propose to the American Psychiatric Association that an analytic induction study should be done in this community, or whether a thematic analysis type of study might be better. You'll pull this information from page 140 to 142 of the Adams and Lawrence textbook to help you answer this question, and it should be a minimum of 150 words long. Part number E, were 3 points in keeping with the small n nature. When the small n is 1, we're only looking at one community, not hundreds of them. The small n nature of qualitative research, it is significant that your research will only be done in one of these communities. As it relates to the extent to which your findings will be generalizable, explain the rationale for picking either analytic induction or thematic analysis for your research. Your answer should be a minimum of 100 words long. Part number F. Fast forward another 3 months. So now we're 9 months into our study here. 6 months to do the survey results, 3 months later to actually go in and be a participant observer in one of these communities. You're ready to summarize your findings now, and imagine in your own mind what your experience was. I'm not going to tell you what your experience was. You have to imagine based on what your own experience with religion has been, and describe what you think you would find in a community of religious fundamentalists. There is no right or wrong answer here, only your imagination, so you should form a very clear picture of your imagined outcome in your mind. Base your mental picture on what your own experience with religious fundamentalism has been, and if you have read Margaret Atwood's book, A Handmaid's Tale, or seen the movie, you can use that as a basis for argument if you would like. Now, with your mental image clear in your mind, think of how the goal of qualitative research is to explore 3 main elements of human experience, namely, as shown on here, what do you capture with qualitative methods? This is from a previous textbook that I've studied, and a good resource. The Remler and Van Ryzen textbook described what you capture with qualitative methods. You capture rules and norms that are taken for granted by experienced participants or cultural insiders. So remember, you're a participant observer. You went and lived in this community for 3 months. You discovered and explored routine actions and social calculations that happen below the level of conscious thought. So what do people who are born and raised in these communities do subconsciously? And actions and thoughts that are not generally recognized as part of the story, such as personal rituals and routines, are sometimes missed or hard to uncover in conventional interviews because people may not think to mention them or may not consider it silly to even bring them up. So by being a participant observer, you got to see what people would normally not even consider important, but as somebody who came in from outside, you saw and observed these behaviors and you think, oh my gosh, they're not even describing this to me in an interview, but I'm seeing this with my own eyes now. That's very important. So, to answer part number F, I want you to look at those 3 things, rules and norms, routine actions, and rituals and routines, and using these 3 phases as a foundation and considering the sentence that we talked about earlier, a religion, faith, or book cannot be abusive, but the people interpreting these things can make anything abusive. I want you to prepare your recommendation for the American Psychiatric Association as to whether or not, in your opinion, religious trauma syndrome should be included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here. This part of the question is graded solely on the strengths of your argument and how you integrate the 3 elements of human experience that Remler and Van Ryzen referenced. There are 2 points each for the way you answer and respond to each one of rules and norms, routine actions, and rituals and routines. Your answer should be a minimum of 250 words. Question number 3 always gets everybody because they try and make it more complicated than it is. So I want you to read it very carefully, and I want you to actually pull out a ruler and a pencil and draw the lines, which you'll see me incorporate here. But in the regression of mathematics test scores as the dependent variable, so the dependent variable is y, right? So this is the y-axis. Mathematic test scores are on the y-axis, and gross national product per person on the x-axis. That's your independent variable, so that's across the bottom. The idea that math scores will go up as a nation's wealth increases is supported. Okay, so that's the regression line. To ensure that you know how to read the graph, find the X that marks New Zealand near the regression line and below the E in New Zealand. So that's right about here. And to draw a line backward here to the y-axis for New Zealand. And you come up with about 485. Netherlands, find the X for the Netherlands, which is right behind the N. Draw a line backward to the y-axis, and you'll come here and hit the wall at about that y-axis at about 555. So we see a difference in math scores here of roughly 70 points between New Zealand and the Netherlands. Now, gross national product per person, if you take a line and draw it from the point on the regression on the scatter graph, the scatter plot, from the X of New Zealand, and you draw it straight down, you'll come to about $16,000 on gross national product per person. And from the Netherlands, drawing the line straight down from that X, you'll see that the gross national product per person is about $23,000. Okay, so we see a difference in gross national product per person of about $7,000. So the argument is when math scores go up about 70 points, gross national product goes up about $7,000. That's the way a regression works. Okay? So what I want you to do is, once you understand how to do that, there's also a video that you can watch, which I've given you a link to. It's video number 1 of the SPSS tutorial from assignment number 5. But what you need to do now, there's only 2 parts to this. Part A asks you to look at Macedonia with its X below the D in Macedonia. And let's say Macedonia set a goal to increase its math scores to 500. What would the probable outcome be on the gross national product per person by the time it made all the changes necessary to accomplish that goal? Now, there are literally hundreds of things that can change a math score that would also at the same time be something that would increase gross national product per person. Remember the idea that you can have bias from an unknown common cause as represented by this model here. Remember we talked about whether family dinners are correlated to a decrease in how kids will start using drugs or start smoking. Okay, so kids who have dinner at home with their families are less likely to start smoking and start using drugs. We don't know whether it's the family dinner that causes that or whether there's some other elements in there that cause that. But we do know that there is a correlation between kids who eat dinner at home with their family and who delay picking up the habit of smoking and using drugs. Okay, so it might be the urban environment. So here's family dinner on this bias from an unknown common cause. So we have family dinners together and there is less drug use. So that's the negative correlation there. But maybe it's because these families are in an urban environment and an urban environment increases a drug use. But family dinners and an urban environment are negatively correlated because kids work more. So maybe it's the urban environment that causes kids to eat less dinner at home with their families. And it's also the urban environment that causes kids to use drugs. Okay, so another model that you may want to incorporate is causal mechanism shown as an intervening variable. So here you have family dinners and you improve the communication within the family, which has a negative correlation to kids picking up the habit of using drugs. Or you have bias from a common cause, which is here we have family dinners, and as kids get older, it's just a natural thing that they're going to have family dinner home. They're going to have dinner at home less often as they mature, and it's this degree of maturity that decreases their propensity to use drugs. Okay, so maturity and family dinners may be correlated positively, but maturity and drug use is negatively, and family dinners is more negative. And so these are the kind of models which I've given you to think from to help you answer part B of the question about Macedonia and math scores. You know, forget the whole drug now. I need you to erase your mind to get drugs and family dinner and urban environment out of your head. They have nothing to do with this question, so just erase that from your mind. And now let's focus on math scores and gross national product. Math scores increasing math scores do not have a direct linear correlation to gross national product. They have intervening variables, and they have bias from a known cause, and they have bias from an unknown cause, and they have all of these other things which come together to increase gross national product. Or maybe gross national product goes up, and all of the things come back in the other direction and increase math scores. this is up to you to answer the way you want. You can go any direction you want with this. You just have to give me 5 examples of something that can at the same time increase math scores and increase gross national product. Gross national product, in case you haven't picked that up from previous classes, increases by having people spend more money in the economy as a whole. Government can spend more money. Individuals can have more money from an improved economy, and that increases gross national product because people have more money to spend. Anything that increases spending on the part of government, individuals, or corporations increases gross national product. How many of those activities actually also improve math scores is up for you to decide and argue and defend in how you answer this question. You only have to give me 5 examples of things that can increase math scores and increase public spending. I gave you one example, so you can't use it on the exam, and that is build a new high school. Okay, so Macedonia is a very rural, agricultural-based economy. Okay, there's not a lot outside the big cities for anybody other than just herding goats, maybe, or growing crops. Okay, so they may have high schools in the big cities, but they may not have any high schools in a rural environment. So when I say build a high school, I say build a high school in a urban and rural environment. You created jobs, the government spent the money, they might have even gotten outside funding from the United Nations to build their high schools or from nonprofits. So it's outside money coming into the country and it increases spending. So building rural high schools will definitely increase gross national product, and it will also increase math scores because these rural kids that didn't have access to high school before will now be able to go to high school. So that's one example. You need to give me 5 examples, 2 points each, of things that will increase gross national product and have at the same time have some kind of an impact on math scores. Or you could argue it the other way, figure out something that increases math scores and figure out how in turn that may increase gross national product. Question number 4 is the biggie. So let's get right into it. This is an example, a story, okay? I like telling stories. So I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to ask you to forget this story as far as the details of the story go, but just think back on the story as the structure of research. So I'm going to tell you a story about how somebody structured their research project in New Zealand, and then I'm going to ask you to forget about it entirely, except for the idea that this was a research project with a certain structure interested in young people. Okay, story time starts. Plain packaging could discourage teenagers from smoking. A new study in Australia indicates that plain packaging could discourage teenagers from smoking. Preliminary findings from focus group interviews with 14 to 15-year-olds in Auckland, New Zealand show that plain packs increase attention to the graphic warnings, increase overall perceptions of smoking harm, and reduce the social appeal of smoking. The finding contradicts tobacco industry claims that plain packaging won't work, adding weight to the Australian government's commitment to mandate plain packaging of tobacco products by July 2012. University of Auckland lead author Lisa Webb told an international conference in Sydney, "Our study found that plain cigarette packaging not only enhanced the salience and impact of graphic warning labels, but also added to the overall message that cigarette smoking is harmful. This study suggests that the combination of graphic warning labels and plain cigarette packaging would send a clear and consistent message about the harm and unacceptability of cigarette smoking, and therefore has the potential to further reduce smoking uptake among adolescents." All right, so you can finish reading the rest of the story yourself, but I wanted you to understand that this was a study done to look into how they can decrease uptake in the habit of cigarette smoking by teens. Now, to answer the following questions, I need you to think in terms of a completely different study unrelated to cigarette packaging. Erase the idea of cigarette packaging from your brain. We're going to talk about peer pressure and whether peer pressure starts kids smoking or peer pressure, alternatively, can be used to stop kids from smoking. Okay? We already know that peer pressure is causing kids to smoke. we want to investigate how we can twist that a little bit and use peer pressure to stop kids from smoking. That's what you're going to have to do. So here's your model. We want to reduce the rate at which adolescents take up smoking. That's your dependent variable. Your independent variable is going to be positive, is peer pressure. Okay, we know peer pressure one direction is negative, and it will start the kids smoking. Peer pressure in the other direction will decrease the rate at which kids start smoking. So peer pressure is your independent variable, but what we're looking at is two intervening variables. So this is what you're going to have to think about. Peer pressure can go positive or negative. Your intervening variables will determine whether this peer pressure is interpreted positively, reducing smoking, therefore in turn reducing the rate at which kids start smoking. And so there's two intervening variables that you can identify in your research to twist peer pressure into something that is positive and reduces the uptake rate for kids smoking. Part number A was worth 6 points. Once again, this is like question number 2. I want you to word an alternative hypothesis and a null hypothesis to guide your research. Once again, finish reading this question before you try and answer part number A. So read parts B through E and formulate an answer or direction in your head, and then come back and write your hypothesis. And then go on to part number B. You will next outline 3 questions for a survey that you would put together before rolling out a national program. This is exactly like question number 4 in the midterm. I need you to word survey questions with answer options predefined. These are not open-ended survey questions that you're writing here. These are survey questions with predefined options as answers. They have to look like this. This is the way a survey question looks for research. How were you made aware of your program's degree requirements and policies? This is a survey that we have used in the School of Public Administration to determine a little bit about our students. It asks a question, it gives 5 options to answer it. Nothing else. This is not an open. I need something like this for each one of these questions on on each part of this question number 4. So identify who is your study population, and that's your first question. Okay? Your first question needs to tell me identity. It needs to tell me who is this study population and how will you isolate the particular subpopulation that you're interested in. This question should render nominal or ordinal data as your answer. I need you to ask a question that will identify a study population for me. Who exactly are we interested in? How old are they? What identifies them as a population of interest to us? Okay, ask a question that gives me some information about their identity. Part number C, I want you to ask a question that gives me an idea about magnitude of the independent variable. Okay? The independent variable, remember, was peer pressure. Either positive pressure, peer pressure, negative peer pressure. How susceptible are you to peer pressure? Give me something about magnitude, and it has to go from least to most. That would look like this question on the survey that the School of Public Administration sent out. How many graduate credit hours have you completed since you were admitted to the PhD program? This is not an open-ended question. They weren't able to write down a number. They had to tick a box. 0 to 9, 10 to 21, 22 to 36, least to most in degrees of magnitude. Part number C asks for you to write a question like that. Okay? Part number D, describe your intervening variable. Okay, we've got the 2 intervening variables down here at the bottom. And remember, this survey is interested in exploring not only whether or not teens smoke or not, but it's also seeking to explain the phenomenon of how peer pressure can help in reducing the rate at which teens take up the habit of smoking. These opinion leaders or peers who might be effective in preventing teens from smoking need to be identified and described. Word your third question in your survey in such a way that it will help you define a direction for the next stage of your research. Okay? So, the third question is once again describing a variable, but this time it's an intervening variable that gives us a little bit more information about how adolescents are influenced by their peers, and or how you as the researcher can examine that peer pressure as a positive influence to help them stop smoking, or a negative influence which would actually have the other effect, or whether there is absolutely no influence. Some teenagers may not be influenced at all by peers, and they're just going to go their own way. You need to identify how prevalent all of these possibilities are as it relates to an intervening variable. Part number E, how would you distribute and circulate your survey? Use the index. I want you to use the subject index of the textbook to figure out a way to actually circulate and distribute this survey and get it out there so that you can maximize the response from the population that you are most interested in. I want you to cite the page from the textbook that you used to support your answer. So you're going to have to go to the subject index and look up certain things of interest about surveys and circulating them and distributing them and getting answers and getting participation. So these are all keywords that I want you to be able to find in the index. Okay, last part of question number 4. Once you've identified who the opinion leaders are from your survey, it's time to begin your qualitative research. To do this, you will be interviewing dozens of potential opinion leaders, and the next 2 questions relate to these interviews that you now have to do. You should inform your answers with research vocabulary that you pull from the Adams and Lawrence textbook, specifically pages 106 to 109 will help you answer these questions. Part number F, will your interviews be structured or semi-structured? One way or other. I'm not going to tell you which one to use. You have the survey questions in your mind, and you've already written down these survey questions, so now based on that information that you're going to have back from your survey, is a structured interview going to be more helpful to you, or a semi-structured interview going to be more helpful to you? 3 points for telling me which one you're going to choose, and there's no wrong answer. I just want to know why you chose the one that you did. You can choose both and get 3 points, but the 3 points are awarded for telling me why you chose semi-structured or structured. Part number G, 10 points. Give 5 specific examples of questions that you would ask in your interviews. Remember, when answering part G now, you're committed by how you answered part F. Okay? 5 specific examples of questions you're going to ask are going to look very different for a structured interview than they will for a semi-structured interview. So make sure that you incorporate part F, the decision you made in part F, into the 5 questions that you give me for your interview from part G. Okay? That's it. 5 simple questions that you're going to ask somebody that you identified through your survey as a person of interest in helping adolescents stop, how to intervene in the uptake of smoking by adolescents. That's it, and good luck on the exam. I look forward to seeing your answers.